So it's 3 weeks out to the U.S. election, the race to the White House. Many are saying this is the closest election in a generation. Ultimately, on the 5th of November, Americans have to choose between incumbent Vice President Kamala Harris, who is the Democratic candidate, and former President Donald Trump, who is the Republican candidate. So why is the race so close? Why is it so tight? By now, in years gone by, you have a fair idea of who is leading and who's likely to win. But in this election, it seems pretty much a dead heat, although Harris has a slight edge in the national polls in the what is called the popular vote. That doesn't count for much because ultimately, to win the White House, you have to win something called the Electoral College, and that boils down to a handful of what is called swing states or battleground states. Let's try and make sense of this by speaking to Jim Acosta, CNN anchor and former chief White House correspondent. Thank you very much, Jim, for speaking with us here on CNN News 18.
Thank you, Jacob.
So what is the state of the race as you see it right now? Kamala Harris, like I said, seems to be having a slight edge in the national polls, but what are the chances that she might be able to win the swing states and therefore win the Electoral College?
Well, I think right now, Jacob, it is very much a jump ball, as we would describe it here in the United States in basketball terms. Either candidate could win at this point. I think Donald Trump is perhaps in a good position to win the presidency because this race is so close in the popular vote and according to those national polls. And if the national polls show that this race is deadlocked, because of the way, and you were just laying this out a few moments ago, because of the way our electoral college system works, he would more than likely be ahead in the key battleground states that are needed to win the presidency. Now, we should caution your viewers out there that we've seen the polls get it wrong before here in the United States. And so it is possible that Kamala Harris is perhaps doing a little bit better than what's reflected in the polls. But if you look at these national polls, you're absolutely right. She's ahead by about 2 or 3 percentage points. But if you look at states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, Georgia, all of those rates are almost completely tied up right now. And so that is why this race is so very close right now.
So many people are also talking about how Kamala Harris may end up winning the popular vote, as you said, because nationally she's leading by 2 to 3 percentage points. But eventually, she could end up losing the Electoral College. We saw that in 2016, Hillary Clinton winning the popular vote and yet losing the presidency, losing the White House. What are the chances it could happen again?
We have. It is an antiquated system here in the United States. The founding fathers did not want to have a straight popular vote when they started things up in this country, just to boil that down. And so that is why we still have this electoral college system. We saw Hillary Clinton win the popular vote by some 3 million votes in 2016. She ended up losing the electoral college. We saw Joe Biden win the popular vote by 7 percentage points in 2020. And he was able to eke out an electoral college victory in a handful of states. And so this time around, that is why the pollsters are taking into consideration what has been described as the hidden Trump voter, that perhaps some of these Trump voters don't want to tell pollsters that they're going to vote for Donald Trump over the phone, but they'll go ahead into the voting booth and pick Donald Trump on Election Day or in early voting. And so that is why there's a whole lot of caution in the air right now over all of this and how things might ultimately shake out.
I know much of U.S. politics and, voter choices are dependent on issues that matter domestically, and foreign policy is not a great vote determinant. But we have not one but 2 wars going on right now in the world. You have the Russia-Ukraine war, which is going to enter its 3rd year in a few months, and you have the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. Is that having any impact at all on this race?
I think it is having a bit of an impact in a couple of different ways. When you talk about the war between Israel and Hamas, you have to look at the state of Michigan, where there is a sizable Arab American population. And there's a segment of that population that has not been happy with President Biden's support for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his prosecution of the war in Gaza. Does that level of anger rise to the point where it hurts Kamala Harris ultimately in Michigan? I don't know. We're not going to know that until Election Day. And on the flip side of that, when you look at the Ukraine-Russia war, one of the things that has really concerned a lot of moderate Republicans, centrist Republicans, mainstream Republicans in this country, is Donald Trump's support for Vladimir Putin. He has essentially said that if he gets into the White House, he's going to try to cut a deal with Putin that will end the war between Russia and Ukraine. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that that would not likely end very well for the Ukrainians. And because of that position that he's taken, and you know, you've seen this in the press for several years now, his leanings toward Vladimir Putin on Donald Trump's behalf, that has caused a good number of mainstream Republicans, moderate Republicans, centrist Republicans to say, hey, wait a minute, they're going to go ahead and vote for Kamala Harris. And not even, you know, centrist Republicans, people like Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney, former Vice President Dick Cheney and former Wyoming Congresswoman Liz Cheney, have both gotten behind Kamala Harris, in part because they say that Trump has shown some very authoritarian leanings in his race for the White House this time around and while he was president. But they also cite Trump's pretty obvious support for Vladimir Putin in Russia's war with Ukraine. And so I do think that is a bit of a factor. Is it enough to change the election? We don't know. But you know, any movement in the numbers just by a small margin could make a difference in one of these states.
And of course, for American voters, ultimately domestic issues, I guess, would perhaps outweigh foreign ones. When it comes to domestic issues, there are a lot of people who say abortion is the biggest issue in this election cycle. Is it? Or is it, as conventional wisdom goes, and I think Bill Clinton made that reference 30 or 40 years ago, saying that it's about the economy. So what is the most important issue for Americans going into this election?
Yeah, if you look at all of the polls right now, all of the polls show that the economy, inflation are the big drivers for voters. Those are frequently cited as the top concern for voters heading into this election. Abortion usually comes out as a strong number 2 in most of these polls. Now, you know, a lot of people will say, if you just ask somebody out on the street, what are you concerned about? Obviously, people are going to say the economy. People are going to say inflation, because coming out of the pandemic, prices went up in this country, and it's something that has gotten under the skin of a lot of Americans. But for women, the issue of abortion is very important, and I think it's a key metric to look at, because heading into this election, you have to keep in mind, since the overturning of Roe versus Wade in the United States, which essentially sent the issue of abortion to the states, you have seen a number of referendum ballot measures in states across the country, places like Ohio, places like Kansas, where pro-abortion rights measures passed, where the voters went into the polls and decided that they would like to have greater abortion access in their respective states. Now, places like Kansas and Ohio, those are pretty much determined to be fairly Republican states at this point, but they went in the direction of preserving and protecting abortion rights. Now, is that a hidden issue that we're not really picking up on quite as much heading into Election Day on November 5th? That is very much up in the air. Do women come out in numbers that are not reflected in the polls? I think that is a definite X factor heading into Election Day, whether or not women carry Kamala Harris into the White House.
All right. And finally, you know, as we head into Election Day, November the 5th, and traditionally, you know, by the end of the night, you know who's won and who has lost. But in the last few cycles, particularly in the last one, I think you had to wait all the way till Friday or Saturday for the results to finally come through. Should American voters, should the international community that's watching this race so very closely be readying themselves for the race not to be called on election night? And again, the all-important question, if Trump loses, will he concede? Unlike something that he failed to do last time.
Right. Donald Trump did not concede the last election. He has still not conceded that he lost the last election, and it has been one of the issues that he's hit on out on the campaign trail this time around. He has peddled the same election lies that he was peddling 4 years ago. It animates and excites his base, so he's going to continue to do it. I do think folks around the world should know, and in India they should know, that you know, there are some folks here in the United States who refer to November 5th as Election Day, but there are folks who refer to November as Election Month. It may take days and perhaps weeks for there to be a winner determined in this upcoming presidential election. You're going to have challenges, I think, in a variety of states based on how close things get. If things are within perhaps 1 percentage point, a fraction of a percentage point, you're going to see election challenges, perhaps from both campaigns. And ultimately, one of the things that we're all looking toward here in the United States is, what does Donald Trump do? If he loses again, does he try to incite his followers to do things that obviously are contrary to the American experience of a peaceful transfer of power and conceding election results and moving on? He is not the kind of person who does that. And I think that is something that is looming over everything. It's one of the dark clouds looming over this upcoming election day. And well, it's just going to have to wait and see how it all plays out. Now, if Kamala Harris wins decisively, you hear this from Democrats, if she wins decisively in both the popular vote and in the Electoral College, there's a conventional wisdom here in Washington that perhaps Republican leaders will say to Donald Trump, okay, that's it, you tried, this was your last go at it, it's time to move on from the scene. But we're a long way from all of that at this point. We're going to have to see how this plays out.
All right, Jim Acosta, a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much for joining us and putting the American election and the state of the race right now in context for our viewers. Thank you.
You're welcome.